There were 3 things my church taught me about men before I was ever allowed to marry one. 3 things I believed the way you believe the ground will be there when you put your foot down. I was baptized at 18, married at 19, a mother twice before I was 23. I carried those 3 teachings into my marriage like a girl carrying water she has been told is clean. Not one of them was true. And I am going to tell you all 3. But before I tell you what those lessons were, and what each one cost me in the dark of a house in Gordonville, Pennsylvania, I need you to understand the world that taught them. From the road, that world looks gentle. People drive through Lancaster County and smile at the buggies and the plain white farmhouses with no wires running to them, and they think, how peaceful. I lived behind one of those walls. I will get to the 3 things. I promise you I will. But first you have to come inside the house. Stay with me if you can. Don't click away to something louder. Tell me in a word where you are watching from tonight, so the next girl taught these same 3 things scrolls down and sees she was not the only one. Have you ever been told a man's silence was something you owed him? Stay. I will tell you what was true instead. The dark blue dress hung from a nail on the back of my bedroom door for 3 weeks before my wedding. There are no closets in an old order house. Everything hangs on a nail or folds into a cedar chest, plain and out in the open. And so the dress that would marry me to Jonas Lapp simply hung there in the lamplight, the color of deep water, waiting the way I was waiting. I had sewn it myself. The straight pins were still in the hem, where my mother would check the length. I want to begin there, with the dress on the nail, because the girl looking at it already knew the 3 things. She had been taught them the way she had been taught to can tomatoes and to hold her tongue, not in one lesson, but in 10,000 small ones, until they were not lessons anymore, but simply the shape of the world. The first thing they taught me about men was that a husband leads because God set him over you, and that his leading is his protection. To be under a man, my mother said, is to be safe. The second thing was that a good man does not need to be told what a woman feels, and a good wife does not trouble him with it, that if you yield enough, if you are demutic enough, low and quiet and useful, his tenderness will come to you the way rain comes to a field that has been patient. The third thing was that a man of few words is a godly man, that his silence is his strength, and that a wife who mistakes quiet for coldness has a proud and restless heart. Hochmut, pride. That was the word waiting underneath all 3, the trap door under a girl's feet. A question could be Hochmut. A want of your own could be Hochmut. To need a man to speak to you, that too could be named pride. I learned to walk very carefully over that floor. On church Sundays we worshipped in a neighbor's emptied-out front room or a swept-clean barn, the men on one side and the women on the other, 3 hours on backless benches. I can still hear the low bleed, the second hymn, the same one every time, drawn out of the old Ausbund 1 syllable at a time until a single word lasted a breath and a half. I did not know then that I was being tuned the way you tune an instrument you are forbidden to play, slowly, patiently, to hold one steady note, and never a song of my own. I was not raised by cruel people, and I need to say that early because it matters to everything that comes after. I was raised in a warm kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and the lye soap my mother made by hand. I was the useful daughter. I cooked and canned and minded the little ones and sold pies and shoofly and jam from the stand on Fridays. School ended at the 8th grade, the way it ends for every Amish child, and after that there was the farm and the garden and the long, patient waiting to become a wife. I did not feel robbed. You cannot feel robbed of a thing you have never been told exists. When I was 18, I knelt and was baptized into the church. I took the vow of obedience to God and to the Ordnung, the unwritten rule of our district, the code that is never written down because being written down is exactly what it must never be. I did not understand, kneeling there in my cap with my hair pinned up under it, that the vow I was making was also the lock on the door. You cannot be shunned from a church you never joined. I joined. Jonas came courting the way the boys did, buggy rides home from the Sunday singing, 2 chaperoned visits in my father's house, both of us fully dressed and nearly silent. He spoke to my father before he ever truly spoke to me. He had quiet hands and a serious mouth that almost never smiled, and when my father told me it was settled, I folded the knowledge into myself the way you fold a sheet, and I went on sewing the dark blue dress. To understand why those 3 teachings could fail a woman so completely, you have to understand what they were really for. They were not really about men at all. They were the machinery of something we called headship, and headship is a tidy word for an untidy thing. That a wife submits to her husband as the church submits to Christ. Bishop Christ King preached exactly that at my wedding, soft-voiced and certain, 300 guests on backless benches, roast chicken and creamed celery, and 7 kinds of pie waiting in the other room. A wife submits as the church submits to Christ. I heard it as a promise. I did not yet hear it as a fence. Here is the thing the teachings hid inside their soft words. In my world, a woman's yieldedness, her Gelassenheit, was held up as the highest beauty she could own. To surrender the self was holy, and a virtue that asks a woman to have no self is a very useful thing to hand the people who will need her to make no demands. Gelassenheit was sold to me as peace. It worked as a leash. I did not have that word for it then. I have it now. My therapist, an Englishwoman with a quiet office and a great deal of patience, gave it to me 1 word at a time, the way you feed broth to someone who has not eaten in a long while. Coercive control. It took me a year to be able to say those 2 words without my hands shaking. The week before my wedding, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table. I thought, this is it. She is going to tell me what I do not know. She folded her hands. She said 7 words. A wife submits to her husband. That is what God asks. Then she stood up and went back to the dishes. I was 19. That was the whole of what I was given for the most disorienting night of my life. 7 words and the dark. I want to be careful here because this is the part outsiders get wrong. No one in that kitchen wished me harm. My mother loved me in the only grammar she had. She was handing me the single tool that had kept her alive, yield and survive, because to give me anything truer would have meant admitting her own life had been built on the same 3 teachings, and that is a weight a woman cannot always pick up. She softened nothing, because softening it would have broken her. I promise you I am coming to the 3 things, and to the night that broke them. But I have to tell you about Lydia first, because without Lydia, I might never have known what I was walking out of. There was an old woman in our Gme. I will call her Lydia. At a barn raising, behind the long tables where the women laid out the noon meal, she set down a tray of fresh bread and spoke to me without ever once looking at my face. That was how our women said the things that could not be said directly, sideways, to the bread, to the middle distance. She said, "Child, I am going to tell you what nobody told me, and I am only going to say it once." And then she told me, quietly, exactly how a wife is broken. Not with a fist, never with a fist. One warm thing at a time. She had married at 18. She had believed the same 3 things I believed. She had buried most of herself in the ground of a marriage and called the burying obedience because there was no other name allowed. I did not understand all of it that day. I was a young wife with a baby on my hip and tomatoes to can. But I carried her words home the way you carry a coal in your apron, and they sat in me and they smoldered. A woman wrote to me once and said the Amish life looked so peaceful from the road. Lydia was what the road never shows you, a woman who knew, who had always known, and who had no one to tell until she chose a frightened girl behind the bread tables and told her the truth before it was too late. So here are the 3 things, and here is how each one died. The first was that a husband leads, and his leading is God's protection over you. To be under a man is to be safe. I believed it until the night I first said no to Jonas. I was 21, the year before Annie was born. I had canned 48 quarts of tomatoes that afternoon, the kitchen like a furnace, my back a single bright line of pain, and that night in the dark I said no. I said it small. Jonas did not say a word. He turned his back and breathed the way a man breathes when he is deciding something. And the leading I had been promised as protection showed me what it actually was, a door that opened only one way. There was no appeal above him, because above him was God, and God, I had been taught, had already spoken through him. The wringer washer my father had built stood silent in the wash-house, the day's wash long since wrung out and hung, and I lay there thinking that even the machine was allowed to rest, and I was not. Protection you are not allowed to refuse is not protection. It is ownership wearing a softer coat. The second thing was that if I was good enough, yielded enough, his tenderness would come, that my goodness would buy his warmth. I was the best wife I knew how to be. I never complained. I never let the cold in. And when I said no a second time, I learned what my goodness had actually purchased, which was nothing. Because the warmth was never mine to earn. It was the community's to withdraw. Jonas did not rage. That is not our way. He simply went quiet, and the quiet spread outward from our bed like frost across a window, to my mother, who came to my kitchen with a basket of bread and said one sentence, "A wife who lets the cold in cannot complain when the house freezes," and picked up her empty basket and left without looking at me. To the women who used to linger after worship and now did not, the whole Gmei, faithful and gentle and certain, turned the temperature of my world down 1 degree at a time, until saying yes was simply the only way left to be warm. That is the thing I need you to hear. No one ever raised a hand to me. They lowered a thermostat, and they called it God. The third thing was that a man's silence is his strength, that quiet is godliness. I believed that one longest, because believing it let me go on loving him. But lying awake beside Jonas's turned back, I finally understood that his silence was not strength, and it was not coldness either. It was the same emptiness that had been poured into me. No one had ever given Jonas a single honest word for any of this. He had been handed a script. A husband leads, a wife submits, and he followed it the way he had been taught, in the only language he was given, which was no language at all. Jonas was not a monster. Jonas was a fellow captive who had been robbed of words just as I had, and we lay there in the dark, two people with no map, and called the silence between us a marriage. There is a word for what all of it was. My therapist gave it to me slowly. Consent that is not consent, because the cost of saying no had been made unbearable. Not one violent act in any of it. Just a girl taught 3 things about men, every one of them built to make her easy to keep. The protection was control. The tenderness was a leash. The silence was 2 robbed people in the dark. Not one of the 3 was true. And the worst part, the part I am still learning to carry, is that I would have gone on believing all 3 until I died, the way Lydia very nearly did, if a stranger at a produce stand had not asked me one question I had no answer to. The question was Diane's. She was an Englishwoman who bought my shoe-fly pie every Friday at the Green Dragon Market for 2 summers and learned my name. One Friday, making small talk, she tilted her head and asked me, "Do you ever get to choose anything, just because it makes you happy?" No one had asked me that in 25 years. I did not have an answer. I thought about it for a week, and then for a year. After that, I began, in secret, to read. A library book hidden in the barn loft, a cheap prepaid phone in a coffee can behind the harness, the voices of women who had left, read by lamplight after the children were asleep. The world I had been taught to fear kept turning out to be kinder than the one I had been told was safe. I live alone now, in a small apartment in the city of Lancaster, 20 minutes and an entire universe from Gordonville. I left in the autumn with 1 suitcase. The ban came the way I knew it would. My letters to my mother come back unopened, the address in my own hand. My father looked through me once in town, as if I were made of glass. I am not divorced. In the old order there is no such thing. I am banned, and to them I am as good as dead, and the 2 children I left behind are being raised a few miles from here to believe exactly that. Levi is 6, Annie is 4. I see them a painful handful of times a year. I will not dress that wound up in pretty words. Some of what was taken does not come back. I left because the only way the system would let me keep them was to disappear myself completely, and a disappeared mother is not much of a mother to leave them. I reached toward them the only way left to me, through one of Jonas's sisters who has not entirely closed the door. A note passed, a word carried, a thread so thin I am afraid to breathe on it. It may never become more than a thread. I have had to learn to love them across a silence wider than any road, and to make a kind of peace with the chance that the silence is all I will ever be given. I have to tell you one more true thing, the hardest one. Before I left, I had already begun to teach my daughter the 3 lessons. Not in words yet, Annie was too small for words, but I was teaching her to make herself smaller. I was showing her, with my own bent shoulders and my swallowed no, that this was what a good woman was. They taught me that being good meant making myself smaller until there was nothing left of me to refuse with, and I was handing it down. That is the thing I left to break, the line of it, running down through the daughters, one quiet woman teaching the next. I kept the dark blue wedding dress, not to wear. It is folded in the bottom of a drawer in a city apartment, and sometimes I take it out and hold it, the straight pins long gone from the hem, And I think of the girl who sewed it, believing 3 things that were never true. I do not hate her. She did the best she could with the only map she had ever been given. If you were ever handed a catechism about men that was really a set of instructions for your own disappearance, I see you. If you were ever taught that his silence was your fault, that his tenderness was something you had failed to earn, that being owned was the same thing as being safe, I see you. If you ever lay in the dark and said yes because you were too tired to survive what no would cost you, I see you. I see you, and I am telling you the thing it took me 26 years and a stranger's question to learn. Your no is a whole sentence. It always was. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.